Hello, my name is Michelle Hodgson. I'm the Festival Director, and I'm talking today to Nick Trend, whose book is What Art Can Tell Us About Love. Nick is a journalist and an art historian. As Chief Culture Editor for the travel desk of the Daily Telegraph, he's spent 3 decades writing about the world's art treasures, and he's produced many guides to many of the greatest museums and art collections. He's also worked on the curatorial staff of the National Gallery in London and has a degree in English literature from Cambridge and a PhD in art history from the University of East Anglia. His new book, as I say, What Art Can Tell Us About Love, explores the love affairs and other kinds of relationships that inspired some of art's greatest masterpieces. So, Nick, welcome to Huddersfield Literature Festival.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
So I thought we'd start in your introduction. You say that painting can be an act of an extraordinary intimacy, and I've never really thought of
Mm.
it that way before. But of course, the relationship between the sitter and the painter. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, well, I suppose the idea for the book came from when I was working at the National Gallery, and I was working on the Dutch 17th century paintings, and I used to go into the Rembrandt room quite a lot. And there was one portrait in particular which really struck me. It seemed to have a sort of a presence and a power which the other portraits didn't have. And it's a portrait by Rembrandt of the second love of his life. His first wife died, Hendrika, and I think that sense of intimacy and connection between the sitter and the artist is as strong in that painting as in any other painting I've ever seen, and made me wonder about, is there a difference in the way that artists depict their lovers compared with others more straightforward portraits? And I started to look around and research and think about other works across the whole of art history, right from the 15th century up to the 21st century. And I think, I mean, in the end, I think the answer has to be yes. That there is this incredibly intense connection when you're trying to depict someone you're deeply in love with. It's not always a positive thing. I think love's a very complex emotion. There's paintings about rejection, there's paintings about anxiety, there's paintings about unrequited love. But overall, I think there is a particular power to paintings inspired by those feelings.
And I'm interested in the section headers you chose for the book. So you started with
Mhm.
enduring love and ended with unrequited love, with various
Mm.
times in the middle. Um,
Yeah,
what made you come up with this particular structure for the book?
I think because there are, those are the things which emerge. Some artists like Rembrandt, like Rubens, they that like the Spanish artist Sorolla, they had lifelong relationships. Well, Rembrandt and Rubens both lost their first wives, but they had each had two very long, strong relationships. But some artists had a lot more fun. They had many different partners. They had obsessive affairs, and they moved on to other partners. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that there is this strand of artists trying to grapple with the feelings of rejection or unrequited love, and that came through as quite a strong theme too. So they sort of fell. There are 28, I suppose you call them love stories, or 28 chapters, and they sort of fell into 6 or 7 different categories, and the category titles almost wrote themselves, I think. And it's always good to have a structure to a book like this, and it just seemed like a natural thing.
And I think it's much more interesting than just going chronologically as well, because it shows how these themes echo across the ages.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing which I think came across really strongly, and which I felt with that first Rembrandt portrait, which inspired the book, that the, you could sense that Rembrandt was grappling with emotions which we still grapple with today. Nothing's changed in the realm of human relationships. I don't think. I mean, they get more complicated because we can talk like this, can't we? Across the internet, we can text, but essentially the the power of the emotions involved and the effect on the individual hasn't really changed in hundreds, well, presumably ever, and that comes across very strongly in art history.
The book really is beautifully produced. I mean, there's some fantastic kind of reproductions in there. And I wondered if you were partly swayed by the beauty or the power of some of the paintings, or was your starting point always the artist and the object of their affections?
I think there was, not all artists paint portraits of their lovers or husbands or wives, um, but I think I had one primary qualification, and that was I wanted them to be really gripping love stories. Essentially, I wanted them to have had interesting relationships or sequences of relationships, and I wanted the art to be of the highest quality. So I often summarize the book as it's a book of love stories illustrated by some of the greatest artists who ever lived. So I think the quality balance is on both sides. You want an interesting story, but you also want some fantastic art in there as well.
And which section did you find most interesting to write? Was there one that stood out for you?
Gosh, yeah, I think I wouldn't say there was a particular section which stands out. I quite enjoyed the earlier stuff. There's for example, I enjoyed writing about Filippo Lippi, who was supposedly a monk who fell in love with a young nun, and well, it's the story goes that he abducted her, but they probably ran away together. But because there wasn't then such a tradition of artists painting portraits of their family or their wives or their lovers, he uses her as a model for religious painting. So she often appears as the Virgin Mary in his altarpieces. And they had a son together, and it's pretty clear that the child that the Virgin Mary um, holds is his son. He also depicts her as Salome, who danced for Herod famously, a famous opportunity to paint for a more erotic theme in religious art. So I quite enjoyed that mechanism, I suppose, for using his lover, his wife, as a model for in religious paintings. But I also enjoyed, the later stuff. The Peter Blake, who's still alive today, the pop artist, is quite open about this. But he fell in love with Pauline Boty, who was another very talented pop artist in the 1960s. She died tragically young, and he painted a portrait of himself holding the Valentine's card that he made for her, and that she rejected. So I think there are particular favourites among the stories, but I don't think I particularly was drawn to any one category. I don't think.
And I noticed there were also photographs in the book.
Mm,
And for example, the chapter on Lee Miller, who, of course, was the film made about her recently, war photographer,
yeah.
Man Ray, and the chapter on Clifford Prince King, which I thought was really moving, and the portraits he created of black gay men. And I just wondered,
Yeah.
we, I mean, including photographs opens up a whole new area. Were you ever tempted to make that a separate book?
Uh, yes, I mean, photography isn't my speciality. Painting is much more my speciality. But I was very moved by like you were, by that Clifford Prince King story. He's a young black American photographer. I think he's only just in his early 30s, and I just discovered by chance his work online and read one or two interviews with him where he was discussing, as a young black gay man in America, there weren't with an artistic bent. He didn't have role models, visual role models, other than the kind of, sort of gangster or tough heterosexual um, male um, characters who appear in films or photographs or fiction. So he was trying to create his own genre, and I think, and he does it incredibly tenderly. He paints his friend. He photographs his friends and lovers. Um, and that's his skill. It's photography. He's not a painter. He's a very subtle photographer. And I just responded to them, I think, as I might have done to a painting. He uses a very restricted palette, a lot of orange. They're very warm, a lot of orange and a warm light. Um, and I just thought there was a sort of painterly quality, almost actually quite like Rembrandt in terms of the palette. So yeah, I was really pleased to include photography in the book, and I'm sure that there would be a really interesting book to be done purely on photography, but it's not my speciality.
And I also thought another one could be done on sculpture if it was someone else's.
I completely agree, and a prime candidate there, and he was nearly included in the book. Although I have to say, he had quite a few lovers with Rodin or Auguste Rodin in Paris. The problem with photo, if I'm really brutally honest, the problem with sculpture in books is it's really really hard to photograph and make it look appealing. Um, it might work better on video, but because it's three-dimensional and because it often doesn't have much color, I mean, there are lots of exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, sculpture tends to be fairly monochrome. It doesn't translate into the pages of a book terribly well, but you're absolutely right. It's another really strong theme. I mean, I wasn't sure in doing this book. I wasn't short of material. It was a question of
No, that's
selecting the best range I could. Yeah.
and some of the stories behind the paintings are incredibly sad. One example, Dora Carrington taking her own life after
Mm,
um,
mm.
Strachey died, and that was a platonic relationship.
Yes, I mean that of all the stories, Dora Carrington's life, she was part of the Bloomsbury set. Had a very close relationship with Lytton Strachey, the historian. I mean, basically, she was in love with Lytton Strachey. He was gay. He was in love with a man who she married, but he didn't love Lytton Strachey. And then she married him, and he turned out to be a philanderer. So she had an affair with somebody else. And um, in the end, I suppose she had a sort of long-term platonic love affair with Lytton Strachey, which, as you say, and ended very tragically. And in the meantime, she fell in love with another woman, who then rejected her. So it's a story of a woman who was searching for love and never really found it in the way that she wanted it. And you can sense that, I think, in the art. But by far her most touching portrait, I think, is of Lytton Strachey, the man she loved, but who was gay. So yeah, that's quite a complex
Yeah,
chapter. so,
not a love
but
triangle, but many, many
yeah.
elements to it.
And of course, I mean that's not unusual among artists. They are a bohemian lot, and there are lots of examples of male artists in particular seducing their models. And I particularly like. I don't know if you read the chapter about Suzanne Valadon, who was an artist in the late 19th century, early 20th century Paris, who modelled for Renoir and Toulouse-Lautrec and had affairs with both of them. She also Eric Satie, the composer, fell in love with her, but they had a brief affair, but then she rejected him. But then while she was modeling for all these artists, she watched them work and she learned how to paint, and she had turned out to be a very talented artist. And when she was around about in her early 40s, she she met one of her sons. She had a son when she was only 19. She met one of his friends, and she seduced him by asking him to model naked for her. So I rather like
And she ended up
that
marrying him
twist.
as well, didn't she?
Yes, yes,
I didn't think the story would go in that direction, but yeah.
no, that's right. He was 20 years younger than her. She ended up marrying him. He's called Andre Uta. He's a rather bad artist himself. And they had rather a tempestuous relationship, and they eventually split up after about 20 years. But they ended up buried together in a cemetery north of Montmartre. So I think they were always soulmates. But I rather like the fact that she was probably seduced as a young model, so that she turned that on its head and found her husband, or her second husband, in fact, it was, by seducing him in the same way.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's been a lot of talk about women artists being kept out of the history and past, and it's great to see so many stories about women artists in the book as well. Um, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we look and enjoy paintings, and how
Hmm.
do you think it changes how we view paintings when we've got knowledge of the painter's life and their relationship with the sitter?
Yes, I mean, this is in many ways what the book is about. It's about trying to inform people a little bit more around the stories behind the paintings. I find it very rewarding. I want to understand why a painting was made, why it looks as it does. You have to be very, very careful. It's easy to read your own emotions and your own prejudices, I suppose, into the work. But on the other hand, I don't think you can fully understand it unless you know a little bit more about the context in which it was made. And I actually enjoyed again the earlier stuff where we don't know quite so much about an artist's life, so we may not have any letters. We may not even, in the case of the Raphael chapter, for example, we may not even be sure um, exactly who it is he's painting, but we can deduce a connection. And they become, those chapters are sort of mystery stories, I think, in a way, raising questions as much as answering them. Sometimes with the later stuff, there's almost too much information, and but I do think that it is important. I think it's more engaging for people if they understand the stories behind the works, essentially. And that's true, I think, of all the arts. It's true of poetry, it's true of novels, it's true of music as well.
And it's interesting, there have been so many novels recent. I mean, from Girl with a Pearl Earring onwards, Still Life was a recent one, and The Painter's Daughters, about Gainsborough's daughters, where
Yeah.
they take the facts that are known. I mean, often I think these novelists do an awful lot of research, but then extrapolate out and create a whole story around them, which I love reading books like that.
Yes, I think that relationship between art and fiction, or art and poetry, is really, really fascinating. I mean, you're in the case of the girl with the pearl earring, you are getting a very subjective account, but it's informed by the painting, and as you say, by her research. Vermeer, who made the painting, is particularly tricky because we don't know very much about his life, but we know a lot about the rooms where he works because he evokes them so beautifully, um, and there's so much detail in the paintings that they lend themselves very well, I think, to be an inspiration for yeah, an inspiration for more art. It's not documentary, but it's still meaningful and moving work, I think.
Hmm. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time today. So, the book is What Art Can Tell Us About Love by Nick Trend. We have two festival independent booksellers that we recommend buying from, Fox Lane Books and Reed Bookshop in Home First, both of whom which you can find online very easily. What's going to be next for you, Nick? Are you planning another book or are you
Um,
taking a break?
yeah, I am, I'm afraid. I've got another one coming out quite soon in September, which is because I work in travel as well as art. It combines the two. It's called The Art of Travel, and it's in the footsteps of the great artists in Italy. And it's really about seeing art in situ. So some of the greatest and most influential paintings and sculptures are still in the chapels, in the palaces, where they were originally made for. And about how best to follow on the trails of. There are 12 different artists. So, for example, one of my favorites is Caravaggio, where a lot of his most important work is still in the churches in Rome where it was made. And there's something very special about seeing art in that context. So
It's
that comes
like
out
the
in
grand
September.
tour, isn't it, of the past? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it was only recently I got to see the Monet's water lilies in Paris, and just,
Yeah.
I mean, it was always intended as something you immerse yourself in, but my goodness, it's very different from looking at them on a picture, on an image or online.
Yeah. And of course, that the story behind that is that he worked in conjunction with a French politician called Clemenceau to install them in that building right at the end of his life.
Yeah.
in the Jeu de Paume, in the Orangerie and in the Tuileries Gardens. So that is a classic example of work in situ as the artist intended it, and yeah, it's a wonder. That's I've got that volume comes out next year. That's on France, so it will be in that one.
Fantastic. Well, I'll look forward to seeing both of those. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.